Good morning, everyone. What's up? I hope everybody is doing well. I am Matt Hunt, as always, and welcome back for another weekly coaching. We're a couple of minutes beyond 10 a.m. Pacific, so I apologize if you guys have been hanging around waiting, but we are live and we are good to go. So today what we're going to talk about is it's prompted off of a discussion that happened in the Octopi Discord recently, where we were talking a little bit about, or at least there was a question came in the last couple of days about the differentiation between ChipEV and ICM. And I thought it'd be really interesting and useful to go through some examples of some risk premiums in the early stages, talking a little bit about comparing ChipEV and ICM, and really just starting to get a sense of what the differences are, what the major differences are, and at what point we should be applying each of the strategies. So what I'm going to do is going to go straight to the compare ranges tab here. And now we don't have, I think, let me try here, preflop viewer. I want to go to uneven, but then I also want to see if I can compare the even stacked sims. So let's go big blind. 40 big blinds, let's say. Okay, looks like the even stacked sims. They are here. Okay, so there's ChipEV even stacked sims. And then there's, I guess the ICM 25 and the ICM 50 sims are not appearing in this library. Okay, no worries. So what we'll do is we'll go to compare ranges and we'll just use the comparison here of ChipEV and ICM 50 and ICM 25. Now, the question that came in most recently was primarily about the differentiation between ChipEV and ICM 50. So is there really any reason why we have to worry about ICM 50? And I think what is, first of all, the best kind of an answer there, if I look at, let's say, 50 big blinds here, right? If I want to try to pick out the best answer to a question like that, the way that you want to look at it is not, do we need to care about ICM 50? It's in what situations are strategies going to start to differ between ICM and ChipEV, or differ more significantly? Because there are going to be some, but there's not going to be that many, right? If you look at ICM 50 in a vacuum, there's a lot of opening ranges that are going to be very, very similar, right? Now, I'm not going to look, hi Yana, welcome. ICM 50 just means 50% of the field. An ICM sim with 50% of the field remaining. So in this case, it's equal stacks. 50% of the field is busted, 50% of the field is left. So we're a long way from the money, kind of at the very, very beginning of when ICM starts to matter, really. Now, what you will see is that when it comes to the initial opening ranges, which I'll just show you in a second here, let's just look at, let's say, under the gun 7, hijack, and button, because those are going to be good examples of early position, middle position, late position. And we're going to go with, I guess we're going to hide ICM 25 for now. And I'm going to make this a little bit larger so that we can see it in a bit more detail. There we go. And first of all, I'm going to just primarily look at raise first in. So this is just the simple pre-flop raising ranges, ICM 50 versus ChipEV, right? And if you look at the comparison here, there really isn't a substantial change when it comes to the opening range, because we're playing very small pots at this point. We haven't really gotten to the stage where there's any discernible significant impact on our stack just from making a pre-flop raise, right? We have a very simple, small change in our opening range from ChipEV to ICM. We've got 19% here and 18% here, right? And this is with 50 big blind stacks all around. Now, even with ICM 50 and equal stacks, the risk premiums do get inflated a little bit. So, So there's a couple of, maybe ambiguities about these ICM 50 ranges as a result of those slightly inflated risk premiums. But what I do want to show is that once we start to get to the level of 3-bet ranges, responses against 3-bets, and so on, that's where the approaches start to shift. So we're not going to see massive deviations or changes according to just basic opening ranges. As you can see here, we've got 19% and 18%, 28%, 26%, 53%, 51%, right? So not a massive change one way or the other. But if we look at, for example, the big blind defending ranges against these strategies, and we then hide the raise first in, you can now see that things are starting to shift just a little bit, right? In ChipEV, you've got, against early, against middle, against button, different kinds of strategies, obviously. And now you start to see, okay, frequency-wise, we've gone from 50% call and 7% 3-bet against under the gun. Morning, Mathor, welcome. And then now we've got 39% in ICM 50. We go from 56% to 49% against hijack, and then 9% 3-bet stays kind of the same. And then we go from 65% to 60% against the button open here. And the 3-bet stays at about 16% as well. So you can start to see that there are slightly more substantial evolutions occurring here, even just in a fairly simple raise, big blind defend kind of a situation, right? And if we go one step further down the game tree, if we go to what happens if the big blind 3-bets, for example, we're going to start to see bigger changes. So we're going to hide the 3-bet. And this is what it looks like. In ChipEV, you've got 45% call, 6% shove, 42 and 7 against hijack, 38 and 9 against button. And then ICM 50, we've got only 35% call, so about 10% less calling. And we have a little bit of the clickback 4-bet, right? So ICM starts to introduce some of these clickbacks in situations where ChipEV doesn't. You've also got that against the hijack here, more folding in general, 56% folding now, and against the button, 57% folding and only 31% calling. So you start to see more of an evolution as you get into even just a small amount of ICM, because even just a slight element of ICM, even that small risk premium of 2-3%, when you're talking about deep stacks, when you're talking about situations where you're playing all in pots, the tightening up of ranges, the narrowing of ranges starts to happen quite a bit. So it is quite important to note that once we get to that point of even just a small amount of ICM, late registration being over, for example, we now start to see some kind of an element of ICM taking effect in the strategies that we're seeing. So that is one thing that's quite important to keep in mind about just going from an a ChipEV situation to an ICM 50 situation. But what we also want is to be aware that even in some very low ICM situations, so some situations where there isn't a significant risk premium, the changes between ChipEV and ICM do still matter to some degree, right? So I think what a lot of players tend to really struggle with, this is something I talk about in coaching a lot, is the understanding of a strategy that factors in a small amount of ICM, a low risk premium, but not zero risk premium. And I think that's a real struggle for a lot of players, because they tend to kind of veer back and forth between, I'm going to make an extreme adaptation, I'm going to really, go super overboard and assume that I have a really high risk premium and be really tight, or I'm going to go completely the opposite way and I'm just going to quote unquote play normally, right? I'm just going to basically play ChipEV. And we don't really want to do either of those things, right? Those things are not going to be particularly productive, because there are so many situations where we have a medium to low-ish risk premium. Now, if we were to have access to the risk premiums in the sims here for the ICM 50 spot, I would imagine that with all of the stacks being the same, it does inflate the risk premiums a little bit. So I would expect we're probably looking at 4-5% risk premiums, something in that area there as far as those sims go. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to look for some uneven stacked spots where we have the ability to basically compare a ChipEV strategy with an ICM 25 strategy that doesn't have a high risk premium, right? So we're going to go, oops, my mouse is not cooperating, but there we go. We're just going to sort for 250 players remaining or ChipEV here, right? Now we have the even stack ChipEV sims in here, of course. I'm going to actually get rid of that with the big blind here because we don't need that. Oops, get rid of that. And so we're just going to basically take a look at some ChipEV comparisons with some of these low risk premium spots, right? Now, the starting point here is I'm going to have to try to pick kind of a basic sort of blueprint example of a spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a situation where the button has approximately an average stack, right? So we're going to pick, the button has 40 big blinds here, and we're going to look at comparing ideally, a ChipEV version and an ICM version of this situation. So we've got this one right here where the button has 40, blinds have 19 and 35. I think that's pretty good. So we're going to look at this one as a comparison because that's ChipEV as well. So we're just going to focus on these two sims here, and we'll take a look at what the risk premiums are first up. So the risk premiums in the ICM version here, as you can see, are low to medium kind of a level, right? This is with 25% of the field left. Now, if we were dealing with 50% of the field left, we'd probably see them go lower. We'd probably see them go down to 2-3% in a lot of cases, but there are quite a few premiums here that are in that 2 to 3% area. The cutoff here, for example, is a fairly short stack. They don't have players don't have a particularly high risk premium against them. But of course, if we start to look at how players play against the short stack here, that's going to start to be affected by the fact that the short stack has a decent premium of 4% against everybody else. But generally, we just want to keep an eye on where these medium risk premium situations crop up and what kinds of changes in strategies we see from them. So first of all here, if we look at this under the gun open, you can see that the frequency is keeping very consistent here, adding a small amount of ICM to everybody else here, adding a little bit of risk premium isn't really allowing them to drastically open up. All it's really doing is causing them to change their opening range slightly from being quite heavy on post-flop playability, so heavy on 7s, 6s, 5s, and so on, to now being a bit more heavy on suited King X and some offsuit Broadway type hands, just because they have more high card value and more blocker power. So that's a slight change that's happening in the opening range. But let's focus on this button player here. We're going to focus on that because as far as the button's response goes, their risk premium against the under the gun 8 player here is 7.6%, right? Now that's definitely going to be higher than what it would be if we were still at ICM 50, but it's not so high that they're going to have to make massive adaptations here. It certainly isn't at a point where they have to be incredibly conservative. And as we can see, if we compare ChipEV to the ICM spot, they are slightly tighter, but they're not egregiously tight, right? They actually are playing 7% 3-bets instead of 5, so they are playing slightly more 3-bets, and they're just not flatting quite as much. There are quite a few more hands that are maybe a bit more marginal. You've got some of these pocket pairs being a bit more marginal here, and you've got some of these suited aces as well, starting to be more of a 3-bet or fold type of a candidate. Now, if you wanted to create a strategy here for ICM 50, what you would probably see is it would look somewhere in between these two strategies, right? It's very natural to assume that that would be the case, because ultimately, if you're going to deal with a risk premium that's, if you cut the risk premium in half here, 7.6 cuts down to 3.8, well, that would probably be, very reasonable to assume there that the strategy is going to end up kind of in the middle. So we're probably going to see something like 83% fold frequency, maybe something like 11% call or 10% call, and maybe 6% 3-bet, right? So we're not going to see massive changes, but we are going to see some slight evolution there. So ultimately, as far as those strategies go for the end of the ChipEV period, the beginning of the ICM period, they're just going to look like very slight tweaks to a ChipEV strategy, and making massive adaptations, making significant deviations, hugely tightening up, all of that sort of stuff doesn't really start to come into the equation until you start to get much closer to the bubble, or until you start to get deeper into the game tree to the point where players have made multiple decisions, and there starts to be a bit of a knock-on effect on the ranges, right? So here, if I look at, let's say, what happens when the button 3-bets, well, now, not only are we dealing with, a slightly different opening range, but we're also dealing with a slightly different 3-betting range. And now you can start to see big differences between that ChipEV response to the 3-bet and the ICM 25 one, right? So we do start to see there, we've got a pretty passive ChipEV response, lots of calling, not much clicking back, and then some jamming. And we see with the ICM version, there's no jamming really, a decent amount of clicking back, quite a lot of clicking back, in fact, and very little calling. So probably the biggest adaptation at an ICM 50 level here would be to just assume that we are kind of midway between these two responses, right? The stuff that is definitely calling in ICM 25 would still probably be calling. The stuff that is 4-betting or folding here in ICM 25, maybe some of it would start to call at some frequency. You might start to see some ace-10 suited, some king-jack suited, those types of hands might start to call. But you would probably most likely see a lot of these suited aces and suited kings 4-bet bluffing as well, right? So again, it's pretty easy to extrapolate or I guess interpolate, considering you've got the two endpoints here. You've got ChipEV and you've got ICM 25. An ICM 50 strategy is going to be somewhere in between those two things. So I think as far as the choice goes between ChipEV and ICM, I titled this session ChipEV and ICM, ChipEV versus ICM, which is better. The reality is that most strategies in this early stage period are kind of a hybrid. They're sort of playing a lot of ChipEV or a lot of very low risk premium spots, because quite often you'll have situations where either the players behind you are not really under any significant pressure against you, or vice versa. So there's just not really any substantial ICM dynamic. But you will also find situations where once it gets to the point of big stack against big stack or something of that nature, then there starts to be a bit more of a concern for some element of risk premium that starts to come in. So I think it's really important to develop that skill set of being able to be adaptable, right? I think that the ChipEV ICM comparison is not so much a case of we just flip from one to the other. It's very much a case of our strategy has to try to combine elements of both, or try to account for different levels of risk premium. And I think as long as we keep that risk premium element in mind, it really helps us to kind of be able to approximate ICM spots a lot better, because risk premium is just very simply a measurement of the asymmetry between the upside of winning and the downside of losing. So ultimately, if we can calculate our risk premium, or if we can estimate our risk premium, since calculating it's not really feasible, then we're going to do a pretty good job of arriving at strategies that are fairly close to what they should be. And I think a lot of players run into trouble, not just because they are, maybe not making the right choice between ChipEV and ICM, but in particular, they simply just don't know their ChipEV ranges as accurately as what they would want to know, right? So they just aren't really going to be as familiar there with the type of stuff that they need to be. So a couple of different elements that are important there. Now, I do want to kind of highlight a few dynamics here that are quite relevant that we talked a little bit about last time, but I'm going to go further into some of these ideas here just to kind of flesh out how they work and how some of these concepts work with this, can be demonstrated with some of the sims in our library here. I'm going to go into a little bit more of a dynamic of how we handle some of these big stack against big stack spots, because I do feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about how they work, what they look like, how the strategies are built, and so on. What it comes down to is the risk premiums for big stacks around the bubble or in some of these early game ICM situations. They do start to ramp up, but they aren't really as high as what a lot of players would think that they are. And when you see players kind of really going hard at each other around the bubble, that's actually in many cases quite correct, because you get this weird effect where players are, maybe they're surrounded by a lot of other players who are under a lot of pressure, but they themselves are under very little ICM pressure. So I'm going to reset this view right here, and we're going to look for some sims where we have a big stack versus big stack dynamic going on. And the best example that I have in the database, I'm not sure if this was one of the ones that we looked at last time or not, but the best example that is in our sim library here is this one, where we've got 91 big blinds in the cutoff and 97 on the button, right? So I'm going to show you right here just a comparison between these four scenarios, ChipEV going through to the bubble. And I want to highlight the dynamic that exists between these big stacks here. So we're going to quickly hide these bottom ones, and then we're going to mostly focus everything on what happens after cutoff opens here. Now, the first thing to note is that cutoff is opening marginally wider here when we go from ChipEV to ICM 25, but not significantly. The reason they're able to open marginally wider is because they have players behind them that have some element of risk premium against them. So, for example, button does have a premium against cutoff of 8.7. Small blind has a premium against cutoff of 3, and then big blind has a premium of 5.9, right? So there's some element of pressure applied to the players behind, which allows them to open a bit wider. But as we get closer to the bubble, what you're going to find is that that opening range is going to get wider and wider. So cutoff 91. Even with the 97 big blind stack to their left, we've got 41% opening range now, and then if we go down to the bubble, we've got 43%, right? So we get to the stone bubble, they're now opening 13% wider than they were in ChipEV. And that is going to naturally allow the other big stack to their left to adapt to that opening range quite considerably. So if we look at, for example, the button response against this cutoff open here in ChipEV, well, 8 big blind 3-bet, 10% of the time, 13% call, pretty reasonable strategy. If we now see what happens with ICM 25, well, we've got 10% 3-bet, 16% call, so a little bit more calling, in fact. And the reason for more calling is that the players behind are now under a bit more pressure after the button calls. The big blind is less likely to call and go three ways because they don't want to have to battle against two of the chip leaders, right? So the second player, the button player, actually gets to call wider. And then we go to 165 left, so 16.5% of the field. And as you can see, it's getting wider still. 19% 3-bet now, super high frequency 3-bet. I mean, look at like Queen 3 suited is in there, like Deuces is in there, Ace 4 off, King 9 off, like tons of hands can 3-bet here. And then we get to the next step, which is the stone bubble. And now look how wide they're 3-betting. 23% 3-bet, 19% call, super wide, super aggressive strategy, all because of how tight the players left to act behind have to be and how wide that initial range actually is here. So you've got kind of this, what you might call a collusion effect, where the two big stacks get to play a lot of hands against each other because the two blinds cannot really do anything to fight back against the two of them collectively, right? If we look at what happens when the button 3-bets in ChipEV, well, small blind gets it in 16% of the time. And then when the button 3-bets, even with a small amount of ICM, that goes down to 13. 16% of the field, it goes down to 6%. And then stone bubble, small blind only gets it in 2% of the time. So if it goes raise 3-bet, the small blind actually has to fold ace king offsuit. And this is why this big stack versus big stack dynamic kind of becomes what it is. It's that everybody else behind these two players is under so much pressure here. If we moved these two players to early position, then it would obviously neutralize this dynamic a little bit, but it wouldn't do that much. They would still be able to fight against each other quite a lot here. And if you look at big blind, it goes from 10% to 9% when you add some sort of light ICM here. But then you go to 165 left, goes down to 8%, and then stone bubble, oops, that's not the right page. Stone bubble, you've now got 8% again, right? And the reason why the big blind is a little bit more able to shove here is simply because the big blind is actually going to be able to have some fold equity here, right? Big blind is going to have fold equity in situations where other players are not. So I'm just going to get rid of a couple of these extra windows so I don't keep clicking on them. Close window. There we go. Okay. So yeah, the big blind is going to have some fold equity in situations where the small blind would not here. And that is going to allow them to not quite have to tighten up as much. But the fact that the small blind is forced to tighten up so significantly, that matters a lot here. That really counts for a lot in terms of the responses. Now, what I also want to do is look at what the cutoff does against this button 3-bet. So I'm actually just going to quickly hide these just to make it a little easier to see. So this is the transition between ChipEV and sort of soft ICM, 25% of the field here. And as you can see, there is some change, but it's not a massive one. And in fact, it's kind of response, it's kind of a pretty similar response, even though the button is changing their 3-bet range a little bit, right? So the pocket kings and aces and stuff are still 4-betting. Queens is now a little bit more passive, but you've still got some 4-bet bluffs coming in there. And naturally, the cutoff is still going to have to respond to the button's range being, you know, fairly wide, fairly aggressive. If we go one step further, we now see, this is 165. One step further, we now see the cutoff actually calling more here and 4-betting a bit less. And this seems super counterintuitive because we've now got, you know, high risk premiums, 7.8, 10.2%. You know, these are relatively high premiums against each other, but it comes down to how wide the ranges are. It comes down to the fact that when the button is 3-betting super wide here, when they're 3-betting 19% of hands, that is not something that the cutoff wants to just let happen. The cutoff can still fight back here when this 3-bet range is as wide as what it is here. And finally, if we go even further, if we go to the stone bubble, you can now see that the cutoff is still calling 28% here. In fact, they're also shoving some, even for 90 big blinds, they're shoving with like ace deuce suited, which is kind of crazy. They're flatting a lot of hands, and it basically amounts to they simply can't fold that often, right? They simply can't just let the button get away with all of these 3-bets. They have to fight back to some degree. And even going beyond that, if you look at the fight back against the 4-bet by the button here, which is starting to crowd the screen a little bit, but you can see here, the button even flats a 4-bet, you know, half the time. When this click back 4-bet comes in, the button is 4-betting, the button is calling half the time in, you know, with 165 left. And then they're calling still about half the time on the stone bubble. So imagine this, you know, imagine a scenario playing out where we're a stone bubble, chip leader versus chip leader, and then you've got the cutoff is going to 4-bet with, let's say, like 10-8 suited. That hand is 4-betting like half the time. And then the button is going to call with like king 3 suited. King 3 suited is high frequency call. Even ace 5 off is calling this 4-bet a lot, right? Imagine that. Imagine a hand plays out where chip leaders on the bubble, 10-8 suited and ace 5 off just go to war in a 4-bet pot there. That would not look to anybody as an observer like a hand that was played well by either of these players. But in fact, that's exactly what the solver is recommending here. So just kind of showing us how counterintuitive some of these bubble spots can be, which is to say that they do encourage players to be, you know, fairly conservative in some situations. But if you've got a spot where, for one reason or another, your opponent's range is incredibly wide, then we're not going to be able to fold that much. We're only going to be able to fold at a certain frequency. And especially when you're talking about big stack against big stack, the thing to be aware of is that ICM really is functioning much more on a basis of what's the upside of winning and how big is that upside compared to what's the downside of losing. Because obviously the downside of losing when you have a big stack is fairly significant. But the thing that's changing is the upside of winning. When you're a short stack on the bubble, the upside of winning is minimal because you might double up and you still are not going to have a lot of equity in the tournament. You're still going to be a pretty good candidate to bust sometime soon. If you're a big stack, doubling up is incredibly valuable because you take the chip lead if you double up. Imagine if one of these players doubles through the other here. They go from 90 big blinds to 180 big blinds with only 15% of the field or so left. They might have like 10% of chips in play there. So in the end, it actually comes down to a circumstance where the upside of winning a really big pot for each of these players is actually quite significant. So they do have some incentive to kind of battle each other. And Hostito says that's wild. Yeah, it is. It's certainly, it's not very intuitive. It's definitely a pretty tricky factor to get accustomed to when you start looking at some of these bubble sims, but it is very much a thing. Now, I want to also look a little bit at a couple of other different types of spots that involve big stacks in some of these cases. So I'm just going to switch back to the spot selector. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reset the options. We're going to look for a spot where the big stack is under the gun, right? So we're going to filter for anything that under the gun is above, say, 60 big blinds, 61 big blinds, whatever. Okay, and now let's go. Let's just do it this way. Yeah, just filter for the spots with the biggest stacks under the gun. Okay, so we've got 98 big blinds under the gun there. Okay, that's a nice one. We can get all 4 of those in there. That should be pretty good. Cool. Excuse me. So again, comparing ChipEV to ICM 25 to begin with, we start with a fairly decent-sized opening up of the range here. Even just to begin with, we've got 17% in ChipEV. We go up to 21% in ICM here. So immediately a fairly significant increase in frequency there. If we go to 165 left, we're up to 32%. And if we go to the stone bubble, we're up to 36%, right? So huge changes in the opening ranges there. And what I want to track is how each of these players is responding against this big stack open here. Because again, I think this is an important area where it's worth recognizing that, of course, your opponent has the ability to put some ICM pressure on you, but that doesn't mean that you just have to fold and fold and fold and fold. So let's look at ChipEV versus ICM here for the, let's say this under the gun 7 player with the kind of shallow stack here, first of all. You can see in ChipEV they have some flats. ICM, they don't have any flats, which makes sense. But they're still not super passive here. They have some non-all-in 3-bets, which they didn't really have before. But they're folding 92% of the time compared to 91%, so not a massive change. We start to get to the 16.5% of the field, and now they're folding 93%. So they're only folding 1% more. They're still getting it in, with 9s, ace-jack suited, stuff like that. Pretty happy to go with those hands because of how much wider that opening range is. And then stone bubble, they are now getting it in still with about 4% of hands and 3-betting to 7 here, which is kind of interesting with some other stuff. So ultimately, the idea here is that they're only folding about a couple of percent more often. They're not, folding jacks, folding 10s and stuff like that because of the fact that this opening range is simply so wide now. It's 36%, right? So there's only so much you can fold when the opening range is getting significantly wider, right? I think that's an important aspect of this. Now, as far as some of the other stacks go, let's take a look at this hijack stack with 46 big blinds here. Hijack here has about a 9% call and a 4% 3-bet in ChipEV. And then if we go to the basic soft ICM spot, they're flatting a lot less, only 4% call, but they're 3-betting more. And it's because even though they don't really want to play post-flop against the under-the-gun 8 player here, the under-the-gun player now has a wider opening range. So they can still get away with some 3-bets, right? And we don't want to be too tight in that circumstance because of that. If we fold it around again to the hijack here with 16.5% left, Now they're actually calling even wider, right? And it's because that range is getting so much more significant, 32% now. So even though they didn't really want to play post-flop before, and even now the risk premium here is at, what is it, 12.1%, right? They still are not going to be, wanting to play that much post-flop, but they're facing a 32% opening range. So that range is just so wide that they just cannot fold that much, right? They have to be willing to play some pots here. And they're doing a mix of 3-betting and flatting here, even though we're getting close to the bubble. And if we look more at that, we can now see a similar thing happening once we're on the stone bubble, because now this range is so wide, it's at 36%, but that is now allowing the hijack, even though the hijack is under a ton of ICM pressure here, they are still able to now call 12% of hands. So they actually come almost all the way back around to ChipEV, or even slightly wider than ChipEV here, just because of how wide this opening range actually is. So a really interesting example of a strategy that actually gets a bit more aggressive or a bit wider as we get close to the bubble, simply because the chip leader is able to open so many more hands. So that is a pretty important part of bubble dynamics there. Now, the final thing I want to also cover as far as some of these big stack bubble situations is a spot where the big blind is the big stack. So we're going to look at that. We're going to look at right here. The big blind here has 97. That's pretty solid. So let's go with that. Yana says, wow, it's really interesting. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a really important area to study, really important area to tackle, because of how kind of misunderstood some of these bubble concepts are. If your opponent's range gets really wide, you can only fold so much. So I want to now take a look at when the big blind is the big stack, how that affects some of the other players here. In particular, let's look at the cutoff, because the cutoff has 31 bigs. It's a good stack size for us to evaluate what the differences are here. So in ChipEV, cutoff is opening 33%. In the ICM spot, they're under a certain amount of pressure here. So as you can see, they are actually tightening up a little bit, right? They are opening 30% now. And if we keep going through the ICM spots, we're going to see that tighten up further. 26%. And then on the stone bubble, they are now opening, the 28%. Okay, so there's probably just because there's a little bit more pressure on the small blind and the button here. When you get to the actual stone bubble, they're able to slightly open up again, which is kind of interesting. But if you look at this opening range here and how the big blind's response changes, you'll see a couple of interesting things. If we got cutoff opening, big blind defending here, first of all, go from ChipEV to soft ICM, you can see that one thing that's happening is that the big blind is now no longer shoving anything. They're not really doing any jamming for 30 bigs here, partly because they still have just so much ability to apply pressure, even with non-all-in 3-bets, that there just isn't really as much need for them to shove. You can see that a bunch of these offsuit high card, low card hands are doing really well as bluffs there. So those hands are pretty useful. And they are still actually tightening up just a little bit. And again, this is because the opening range is slightly tighter, right? So just because they are the big stack on the bubble doesn't mean that they can suddenly do a ton of shoving, or that they can defend even wider than normal. It does allow them to 3-bet and put some pressure on here, but they can only go so far with it because the opening range is slightly tighter. And if we do continue through that vein, and we look at what happens in this spot, 16.5% of the field, again, they are making adaptations here. But now is where the ICM pressure starts to ramp up to the point where significant changes do happen. Because now, even though the cutoff is only opening 26%, the big blind is actually defending wider, 74%. In fact, are they defending wider than ChipEV? Yes, they are. So they actually are defending slightly wider than ChipEV here. And the reason for that is that even though the cutoff has a tighter opening range, the big blind is going to realize much more equity post-flop because the cutoff is forced to play less aggressively post-flop. So that in itself is allowing the big blind, the big stack, to defend wider, to play more hands, and so on. So even though they're also 3-betting a lot here, they're 3-betting a lot to apply pressure, they are particularly happy to just realize some equity by calling. And if we do the same thing for this final spot where we are on the stone bubble, similar thing sort of happening, except now they are actually able to shove quite a bit. So once we get to that stone bubble, the pressure on the cutoff is significant enough that the big blind is actually able to start doing some shoving again here. And some of the factors creating this are very nuanced. A lot of it comes down to what the cutoff would do in response to a shove. So you can see here, if in soft ICM, they would still call off 23%. With 16% left, they would call off still 21%. And then here on the stone bubble, they're only able to call off 22%, even though the big blind is shoving with quite a lot of hands, bunch of reasonably weak hands, right? So there's a back and forth that's going on here. I think the main factor to keep in mind really is that any solver output is an equilibrium. By definition, it's an equilibrium. So you always have to think about both sides of that. You have to think about if one player is going to be opening really wide because of ICM, then on the one hand, ICM is going to tell another player play really tight. But on the other hand, the fact that that range is getting wider and wider and wider is pulling in the opposite direction. So it's not always the case that ICM just forces tighter and tighter and tighter strategies. You do occasionally get situations where the change in the raise range, or the transformation of the raising strategy that's happening is significant enough that it does allow a player to defend wider or continue with more hands simply because they are up against such a wide range. And that is a really important factor here. And one other way to kind of illustrate this that I can show you guys is to actually look at some blind against blind spots. Because if we look at, let's say, a situation where the big blind is pretty shallow, let's try big blind has between 10 and 15 bigs. That's probably pretty good. Sort by relevance. Okay, so we're going to look at... Okay, here we go. So is this going to be it? So 13. Oh, let's just do that. Okay, there we go. Sort by big blind stack size. Didn't mean to do that. Never mind. What I'm going to do is actually try to find one where big blind is like specifically like 12 bigs. Let's try that. Well, actually, let's go like 8 bigs. Big blind has 8 bigs. Let's see if we can find that. Okay, sort by relevance. Okay, big blind with 8 bigs. That's good. We're gonna go with this one. So average stack of 19. Big blind has 8. Small blind has 28. So that's stone bubble version of that. And then we've got the 165 version of that. And then we should have the 250 version of that. All right, right there. Cool. So we're going to focus on the big blind range in this spot. And what I want you guys to kind of be aware of is how wide the big blind calls off against a shove. In this spot, the small blind is shoving 61% of hands in ChipEV, and big blind calls off 51%, right? Soft ICM, small blind is now going to be able to shove 64%, and big blind is going to call off 45%. So big blind is forced to call off tighter, small blind is able to shove wider. All of that makes sense. If we now look at this one, so this is 165 left. Small blind is now able to shove 88% of hands, and big blind is calling off 29%. And then in the stone bubble spot, small blind is actually able to shove 100% of hands, and big blind is calling off 11%. So the big blind's call off range naturally gets tighter and tighter and tighter, even though the small blind's shoving range is getting wider and wider and wider. And that's the impact of ICM in a nutshell, right? That is the the sole reason for that is that the big blind has such a high risk premium in these ICM situations on the bubble. However, you can still see that the big blind is not folding stuff like ace 8 suited, right? They're not folding ace 10 off. They're not folding sevens. They're not folding king 10 suited. So it's not that the bubble requires us to be egregiously tight in every single situation when we're the short stack here, because eventually we hit that threshold where even though we have 8 big blinds and we're on the stone bubble, and it's a really annoying kind of terrible spot here where we don't like to call off. The thing about this spot is the small blind is literally shoving any 2 cards, which means that there's really not that many, that there's only so much folding that we can do, right? We always have to keep that in mind. We always have to factor in not just the scenario that we're in and how much ICM pressure we're under, but in particular the small blind shoving range. So I wanted to highlight that for you guys as well, because of the fact that it's so easy to rationalize some tight folds there. So I think that is a good spot to wrap it for today. We've come to a good 45 minutes, went through some more of these soft ICM sims. What I think I'm going to do for next week is I'm going to start sourcing some hand histories from the community to discuss and to break down on these streams. So I want you guys, if you are in the Discord, if you're a member of the Discord, go ahead and post some hand histories in the hand histories channel. I will take a look through there and pick out some of the best ones for an analysis during next week's session. We're going to use the sim archive where we can. We might use some final table spots where we can, but take a look at some of the hands that you've played recently, post them in the forum there, and we'll do some member hand history reviews next time. So thank you, Akashic Priestess, Hostito. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you guys being here. We will see you next week, or I will see you next week. And like I say, drop your hand histories in the Discord for us. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, share the video, all of that good YouTube stuff. Thank you, Yana, and thank you, Jada Alba, as well. Appreciate it. We will be back again next week, 10 a.m. Pacific, same time as usual. There may be at some point soon a change to the time. We may shift it back a couple hours. So not 100% sure yet if next week is still going to be at 10 a.m., but I will keep you guys updated on the Discord if there is a time change there. But thank you, everybody. Take a look at some more of these ICM sims in the library if you would like to. And of course, I will talk to you guys again very soon. Thanks.